evening. I speak to you in honor of our risen Lord, Jesus Christ. Malcolm Gladwell was born in Fareham, England in 1963. His father was an English mathematics professor of Jewish ancestry, and his mother was a psychotherapist born in Jamaica. At the age of 6, the family immigrated to Canada when his father transferred to become a professor at the University of Waterloo, settling in Elmira, Ontario, a mere stone's throw from Niagara. Growing up, Malcolm was gifted in athletics, including cross-country running, and graduated from the University of Toronto, Trinity College, with a bachelor's degree in history. He didn't continue to graduate studies as his marks were not strong enough. So he tried to begin a career in advertising. He wasn't very successful. After trying for several months, he didn't even have an interview. So he changed his plans and he got into journalism. This, as it turns out, was a very good decision. His first job was with the American Spectator, and that meant moving to Indiana. Throughout Malcolm's career, he worked for a few different publications, including Insight on the News, a conservative magazine owned by Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church, and the Washington Post, which he joined in 1996 to write about business and sports. Malcolm Gladwell, though, is most famous for his books, including Outliers, The Tipping Point, and Blink. Now, a business writer and journalist of Jewish and Jamaican descent may seem like a strange choice for a sermon series on how God's influence has continued through to today. So I should probably explain. To understand this choice, there are two things you should probably know about me. First, I'm a systems thinker. There are those people in the world who look at specific topics like religion and science and do not see them as connected, or in fact needing to be connected. They see each topic as its own independent, important, rich, complex topic, full of things to learn, but they never really mix the two. Do you know people like this? Well, that's one way to view the world, and a perfectly fine way to think, but that's not how my brain works. I need to understand how things and ideas fit together into a cohesive whole. I need to understand how math relates to people, how chemistry connects with relationships. I need to understand how science and God coexist and connect. When I have a new revelation about God and my faith, I ask how this changes my view of what science tells me about the world. Likewise, when there's a new discovery in science, I ask what this teaches me about God and his creation. I need to understand how things fit together. And the more complex the connections, the better. So when someone asks me to think of what or who has influenced my faith, I hear the question, what or who has influenced how you think? My wife refers to me as a thinky talker, and I remain hopeful that that term is a compliment. The second point is I like books. You know, a little. Well, a lot, actually. I love everything about books. I love how they look. I love how they feel. I love the idea that they can store knowledge and history for everyone to access. I love that with a few discerning choices, you can collect a great deal of the total base of knowledge that the human race has accumulated in just a few stylish bookshelves. That is amazing to me. And in fact, every room in our house, except the bathrooms, we have boundaries, have full bookcases in them. So with those two aspects of myself explained, it should come as no surprise that when Martha asked me to participate in the sermon series, I immediately started thinking about my favorite authors, and it was Malcolm Gladwell that won out. So why him and his writings? To answer that, I want to draw your attention to tonight's readings from the book of Samuel. At this point in the Bible, Saul has been rejected by God, and God is looking for Saul's replacement, the future king of Israel. So God directs the prophet Samuel to take leave of King Saul and to go out and find this future king. God says Samuel to Jesse in order to meet and anoint the new king of Israel. Samuel, after some reluctance, agrees to go and heads to Jesse's house to conduct a sacrifice. While there, Samuel has Jesse present his sons to him for God to show the sign needed to anoint the new king. Jesse presents his sons in order, starting with the oldest. Upon seeing the strong, strapping, and handsome eldest son of Jesse, Samuel makes the assumption that this must be the new king. I mean, he looks so kingly. But God surprises Samuel, and likely us, by rejecting his son, saying, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Eventually, the youngest son, David, is brought before Samuel, and it is David that God picks, the youngest, skinniest son, who's been acting as the shepherd for the family's flocks. This is surprising for a few reasons. First, birth order back in the ancient world meant a great deal more than it does today. The firstborn son was the heir to the family estate and head of the family upon the death of the father. Younger brothers were less important, and the further down the family you were, the less important you became. David was the 8th son of Jesse, so he wasn't really in line for much, other than perhaps being a worker for one of his older brothers. Second, David was a shepherd. Shepherds in the ancient world were seen as outcasts of sorts, those uncivilized few who spent most of their time alone, away from the cities, tending the flock by themselves. It was a less than desirable occupation. Yet, it is this late-born son with the dirty job that God picks to be the next and most famous king of Israel. All because God sees the world differently than we do. God is not trapped by our social assumptions and narrow view of the world. He sees more deeply and clearly than we do. Remember, do not look on his appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. And it is this point that brings me to Malcolm Gladwell. In every one of Malcolm's books, he looks at the world more deeply and clearly than the rest of us. And by doing that, he points out and explains some very amazing and surprising things about the world. Most notably, Malcolm helps us see our normal, usual way of thinking about things can be very wrong. And he teaches us that with a slight shift in perspective, we can see and realize so much more. Most of us, for instance, think large changes result from significant initiatives or pressure. If you want to change your life or make changes in your business, you need to make a large, impactful action, right? I mean, that just makes sense. But in his book, The Tipping Point, Malcolm demonstrates that if you really look at large changes, they are very often the result of small efforts made together and at the right time. That a series of nudges, rather than a single large shove, is more impactful at creating lasting change. In this book, Malcolm explains the dramatic drop in the crime rate that recently occurred in New York City. Many people, just looking at the situation superficially or for their own purposes, point to a single large change in policy or resourcing as the cause of the drop in crime. Through a thorough analysis, Malcolm demonstrates that the real reason for the change had to do with a variety of elements, both large and small, coming together at the right time to create enough momentum to make a lasting and significant change. It was not one thing, but many small things that created the environment where change could really happen. If any one element, no matter how small, was missing, the change would likely not have occurred or not lasted. In another of his books, called Outliers, The Story of Success, Malcolm Gladwell turns our ideas about what leads to personal success on their head by looking at things that were weird, out of sorts, or unplanned. Scientific inquiry and modern statistical methodology teaches us to ignore outliers and aberrant data because they cannot really be very helpful in understanding the typical situation or what goes on normally. That thinking has led to many advances and some pretty interesting knowledge. For sure, it has led to some clear thoughts about what leads to success. Work hard, go to the right school, and make the right choices, and you can make yourself successful. That's the narrative. Malcolm, though, rejects that logic and looks down a different path, likely because his own path to successful career was so, shall we say, scenic. He looks at those things that stand out and look strange in the lives of people who are unusually successful. He looks at the outliers, not the commonalities. By looking at the world through a different lens, Malcolm was able to show that success in all parts of life can be better explained by those weird occurrences and random extreme events that happen in our lives. Success is not just about what you do and about your choices. It has a lot more to do with the outlier events that happen around us and that push and pull us in different ways. A bit of a scary conclusion for a world obsessed with the individual and their preferences and their choices, but the data and the analysis are impossible to ignore. Finally, in his book, What a Dog Saw and Other Adventures, Malcolm explains the role of the outsider. He explores situations and issues from the point of view of those new to the situation or those on the fringe of the situation. His analysis shows that those around the issue but not submerged in them often see important things that those wrapped up in the situation either miss or see too late. The common theme in the writing of Malcolm Gladwell is to reject the accepted way of thinking about things and to look more closely and deeply and from novel perspectives. By doing this, Malcolm reveals deep, important truths that are right in front of us and which we regularly miss. Malcolm tries to take on the perspective that God invites Samuel to use when looking for Israel's new king. God invites us to do the same in our lives, to look past the normal social conventions and past our usual ways of thinking, to see the world not as we think it should be, but as it really is. Malcolm shows us that just as God reminds us in Samuel, it is often when we are most sure of how the world works that we have it exactly wrong. Throughout the Bible, God often surprises us with what happens, who he chooses, and what can be accomplished. And regularly in the Bible, both God and Jesus invite us to see the world differently, to see the world more deeply, and to really appreciate its truth and complexity. And if we could only do that more often, we would see the will of God more clearly. There's a quote often attributed to Albert Einstein that often comes to mind for me. I'm not sure if he really said it, but it does sound like an Einstein thing to say. The quote is, "Things should be as simple as possible, but no simpler." The quote means that a theory should account for all the known data in as simple a conception as possible, but not to ignore data just because we come up with an elegant, pretty theory. I think what God is reminding us with this passage in the book of Samuel and in other such passages is that we often make the world simpler than it is, and we are missing important details. We miss what really makes someone a great leader, what really makes meaningful change in the world, and where success really comes from. Let's close with one more example, the battle of David and Goliath, the archetypal underdog story. We pick up the tale of David shortly after the passage from tonight, and we find David with Saul and his army facing down the Philistines. The armies are at a bit of a stalemate, and neither army wants to lose many men in a bloody battle. So it's decided that a one-on-one battle will settle the matter. The Philistines send out Goliath, a huge, strong, professional soldier, and the men of King Saul are terrified, with no one volunteering to fight. David, though, steps up and volunteers to fight Goliath, but no one thinks he can succeed. This is a well-known story of a person overcoming great odds. At least we think that's what it is, because that is the common narrative about the story. But in his most recent book, David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants, Malcolm Gladwell takes a fresh look at the story, rejecting the typical narrative and looking at it from a different perspective. No one thinks that David will win against Goliath because Goliath is an experienced swordsman with far superior physical attributes like strength and reach. Everyone, including the reader, gets drawn into the assumption that David will need to face Goliath on the terms of the giant Philistine. And if that's what David intended to do, then everyone's worries would be justified. But David had no intention of playing by Goliath's rules. He plans on playing to his strengths and rely on his skills as a slinger. As Malcolm points out in his book, slingers are deadly. They can kill running squirrels at 50 yards and throw stones almost as fast as a musket fires. Malcolm points out that David choosing to sling changes the dynamics such that David is in no danger of losing. Goliath becomes the underdog. Think about it. Goliath won't even have a real chance of getting close enough to David to do any damage. David stands back at a safe distance and slays the giant with one well-placed rock between the man's eyes. Malcolm also points out that given Goliath's size, he would be slow, making his chances against a ranged weapon even worse. So David and Goliath isn't a story about someone overcoming great odds. It's a story about the power of looking at the world differently than others do. Everyone saw only one option for David, a sword fight with a giant. David saw more options, probably because he was a bit of an outsider himself, and used that perspective to pick a better path. Malcolm Gladwell, through his analysis of this old story, does the same thing by opening our eyes to a different way of seeing and thinking about this story, and I hope the world. So in this season of renewal and new possibilities, and along with God and Malcolm, I invite you to regularly look at the world in different, deeper ways. Amen.